So, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're really excited to have some special guests in that I will allow to introduce themselves shortly. Just wanted to start by saying that this is a safe space. We will be exploring some topics that people may have had some personal experiences with, may potentially find difficult, but please do take your time and do what you need to do to feel comfortable in this space. We will be encouraging participation either through the chat or in dialogue towards the end of the conversation, but please do engage and feel free to share your views. This is designed to be an interactive space. We're really keen to dig into some of the questions that people have. Thank you for all of those that have engaged so far and sent your questions through in advance. We will be tackling the majority of them. Can't promise that we'll get through all of them because there were quite a few, but we'll do our best to weave them into the conversation as we go. We have got the next hour and 25 minutes together. It will be a really engaging space and opportunity for us to dig into what we've seen across 2023 and our hopes and aspirations for 2024. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mac Alonge. I'm the CEO of the Equal Group. We are a multidisciplinary team dedicated to equality, diversity, and inclusion. We specialize in data and helping organizations move along their diversity and inclusion journey in a measurable and sustainable way. Pleased to be joined by my colleague, Simon Marshal-Wilson. I'll allow you to introduce yourself, Simon.
Thank you very much, Mac, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Simon, pronouns he, him. Great to be on the call this afternoon. And I'm the Senior ED&I Consultant at TEG. So I head up the fantastic group of consultants that we have working with us currently. And just what an opportunity it is just to spend, 90 minutes taking time out, reflecting and thinking about the year ahead also. So great to be on the call. Thanks, Mac.
Thanks so much. And I'm super pleased to have two of my favorite people in the equality, equity, diversity, inclusion space. I'm actually fans of both of these individuals. The knowledge that they share, the wisdom, the lessons, learnings, understandings, experience that they have is absolutely mind-blowing. And I'm sure you're all going to gain a lot of wisdom from them on today's call. So I'll allow them to introduce themselves because I'll absolutely not do it justice. So can we start with you, Joanna? Joanne,
Thank you. Joanne. Thanks, Mac. Wow, what an introduction, Sheryl. We'll have to come on here more often. Yeah, thank you. I'm Joanne Conway, Head of Inclusion and Culture International at DLA Piper, which is a global law firm. And prior to that, I worked at EY for 17 years. I've been in the diversity and inclusion space for about 10 years now, and I'm currently doing a PhD on the topic of inclusion and privilege, in particular in relation to race, gender and class. So that's something that I'm particularly interested in. I'm based in Manchester.
Thank
you.
Amazing. Yeah, what an introduction, Mac. I feel as though I need to definitely get a check. Do people still put checks in the post? Yes, it's on its way. But yeah, I'm Sheryl Miller. Really, really pleased to be joining you also. Thanks again, Mac. For the invitation. I'm a diversity and inclusion consultant. I've been in the space of transformation and change for about the last 10 to 15 years or so. Before that, I'm actually a chartered accountant, so I qualified with EY a million years ago. So now I work with organisations looking to make change in this space, typically with leadership teams, staff network and ERG leaders who want to make things better. So that's me.
Amazing, thank you both. And yeah, as I said, really pleased to hear from you. And it's essentially this conversation, we're going to start to explore kind of some of the things that we've seen, the trends, the patterns, the data that we've seen in 2023, also previous years, and then really look towards 2024 to understand what it is that we want to see more of, what it is that we hope we can leave firmly in 2023. It will be a nuanced conversation. I'm going to start off by a little bit of an ask for everyone that's in attendance. Just drop in the chat some of your thoughts and perspectives around what you've really enjoyed about 2023 from a diversity and inclusion perspective. And I'll contrast that with kind of what we've seen from society. I think the last year has been quite tumultuous in terms of what we've seen. There's probably been a couple of steps backwards. from kind of previous years around the kind of EDI landscape. For us, we kind of looked at some of the data that we were seeing, some positive, some negative. So 70% of British companies have embarked on various initiatives to address racism in the workplace since 2020. However, 53% of Black employees and employees of colour said their organisations had either done nothing or they were unaware of any action their organisation had taken. It demonstrates that actually 2020 was quite a pivotal point in terms of the murder of George Floyd and a number of kind of things from a societal lens, including kind of COVID-19, health inequalities that were becoming more apparent, which meant that organisations specifically, were starting to address how they dealt with individuals within the workplace. We've also seen a number of headlines around kind of equality, diversity and inclusion, all kinds of different publications. So we've had ministers coming out and calling for diversity and inclusion managers to be sacked. We've had female executives demonstrating they've got a shorter tenure, so looking at things like the glass cliff, as it's so called. Business leaders not necessarily taking this environment as seriously as we would have expected. And that goes through all kind of facets of equality, diversity and inclusion. Some more stats for you. So only 17% of recent survey respondents from the UK measure the business impact and perceived value of DEI initiatives. 24% of employees felt no one in their organisation took responsibility for EDI efforts, while 30% of employees felt leadership had left the responsibility with employees. Thank you for those of you that have kind of left your comments in the chat. Please do continue to do so. I think one of the things we were reflecting on over the last couple of weeks was the EHRC, which is the Equality and Human Rights Commission, recently updated their Human Rights Monitor. It was previously called the Is Britain Fairer report. It really gives an overview as to how the country is doing from an equality and human rights perspective. And I essentially wanted to play this video just to give a little bit of an insight and context for this.
The state of equality and human rights in Great Britain has changed a lot over the last 5 years. From COVID-19 to the cost of living crisis, there have been significant shifts in how we go about our everyday lives. Our report, the Equality and Human Rights Monitor, uses the available data to see how things have changed for different people across Great Britain. It is the most comprehensive review of equality and human rights. It measures progress in areas such as education, employment, health, and justice. The data presents a mixed picture. COVID-19 and other events have caused some new trends to emerge, such as more people working flexibly. Other longer-term trends have got worse. For example, improvements in life expectancy have slowed down for men and women. Newer changes, like the greater use of artificial intelligence, are also starting to have an effect. Further challenges lie ahead, such as continued health and regional inequalities, as well as increasingly polarised debate on some social issues. Looking ahead, we must collect comprehensive and reliable data to better understand how new and existing trends can affect different people, so that we can drive continued progress towards a truly fairer Britain. Go to our website to find out more. The state of equality.
You're on mute, Mac.
I was saying some wonderful things, Sheryl, I promise you. With that being said, I really wanted to give a chance for kind of guests to really give their thoughts and opinions in terms of what you've seen from a societal lens, both from a risk perspective and also an opportunity perspective. So I guess what are some of your kind of most significant observations around the year that we've had? I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so we can see your wonderful faces. I guess, Sheryl, did you want to kick us off?
Sure. What's really interesting, when you showed all of the headlines about sort of diversity you know, individuals being axed and all of that sort of thing. Because I think as I was sort of prepping for this, I think the one phrase that kept coming up for me was the war on woke. And I think that, you know, almost like kind of encapsulates a lot of what was going on. So that backlash against the movement and the momentum that started in 2020 was a big part, I think, of sort of like last year. I think it probably started in the year before, but certainly last year is when some people were just, you know, calling time on, you know, some of their D&I initiatives and even some of the roles. So that war on woke, a very sort of politicized view, and the whole identity politics and all of that has had which is out there in the kind of socio and cultural landscape, has had a massive impact on diversity and inclusion within organizations, you know. Yeah, so I won't go too political, but that's what I think has had a big impact on D&I within organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And that term war on woke, I think it's come up time and time again in the press, and it seems like there's kind of willful polarization of kind of people that are wedded and bought into diversity and inclusion, those that are potentially quite resistant. Joanne, was it kind of?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that some of that comes from, as well as, is like this misconception around what the role actually is around diversity and inclusion, and what the experts in this field do. So quite often, like, what's in the media or what's kind of being sensationalized is that binary view, but actually there's a huge amount of work that's been done around inclusion, around you know, changing cultures, around working across cultures globally, and the benefits that brings to the organizations, which are really well documented. But, you know, working with networks, of course, making sure that you have representation, working to the legislation like pay gap, for example, and the benchmarks that we have to make sure that we're you know, adhering to best practice. That's only part of the role. Actually, there's a huge amount of work that happens that is aligned to the business, that, you know, leaderships and businesses wouldn't be able to thrive and be able to serve their clients and their communities if they didn't have a dedicated person or team in this role. So I think there's a real risk to organizations, actually, when you take that and you think, actually, it's an initiative, it hasn't worked, we'll take it away. You're not actually looking at the context in terms of what's the value add and what the risk is when you do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And Simon, I was just going to come to you in terms of that link between kind of what's happening from a government perspective, in terms of the narrative that's coming out of government, and the impact that has in terms of, you know, organizations picking up this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, yeah, you can see all the context there, and some of the disruption and the conversations, how they've changed over time. And I think what I've noticed talking to different organizations and different client groups is it's made them then start to kind of question around some of their own EDI plans as well. And I think it's so often an easy trap to fall into, to say, actually, you know, I can hear something that's going on kind of outside an organization. Is that now the focus I need to take on ED&I? And therefore, I suppose that kind of conflict between actually being able to stick to a business EDI plan, but then also maybe answering some of the challenges and questions that are coming in externally as well. And actually what some organizations are just jostling with some of that conversation, and therefore maybe aren't quite clear on how to adapt or react to some of those things that are coming through. So yeah, so very much around that kind of conflict and questioning and self-doubt in some areas.
And yeah, I think on that note, we had a question come in advance that I thought was a really good one, in terms of this whole kind of dynamic between what's happening from a political lens and also kind of what's going on in the media. So the question was, with the ongoing culture wars being stoked by politicians and the media, which seems to be turning majority against minority groups, what can we do to combat this and bring them with us on this journey towards inclusion? It feels like an uphill battle more now than ever before. Any thoughts in terms of how we combat this kind of prevailing narrative, in terms of there being a bit of a polarizing war?
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before. I think there is this we need to find a way to create spaces where people can have points of view without it being a divisive conversation, where and also that there is a word that I find is missing quite a lot in some of these conversations, which is the word "and." So, you know, I can be you know, an ally to the LGBT plus community, including trans community, and I can be somebody who is advocating for women's rights. And too often we get pushed into, you know, from where groups have particular political views on, well, you know, choose a side. And actually that's not, I don't think that's healthy. I think where we will see much more positive change in this space is when we actually are able to create spaces where there is an in-between, and there isn't that kind of that fine for. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, you know, but that is my point of view. I am in this space, and I genuinely believe that there is so much that we can do when we lean into having empathy, and it will just be much better for all involved. So that's my thoughts on it, and I think it's not helped by, like I said, the sensationalization of things and people take headlines in media and they're misconstrued, they're taken out of context, and that just becomes fuel for unhelpful dialogue.
I think just adding on to what Joanne was saying, or should I say, so adding on to what Joanne was saying, because we do tend to see things quite binary, you know, apparently it's the way our brains are sort of wired to an extent. I think in that question that talks about, you know, the almost like the fortunes of the majority versus the minority. Obviously, when it comes to D&I, when it's done well, it should include everyone, right? So the needs of everyone should be considered. And yes, the needs of, you know, historically underrepresented groups, you know, will be different potentially to the minority. But you shouldn't have if you have a group that feels as though they are not included or are not part of D&I, then it's not being done well, if that makes sense. Yeah, it should be recognizing the needs of everyone. So that's the one thing I would say. And it kind of really builds onto what Joanne's saying in terms of, in the way that we create these spaces, we need to create the spaces in a way that we're able to also do both the psychological safety, and sometimes having spaces that are based on affinity or identity, but also doing that in a way which does still include everyone, or everyone feels that there's something for them, is what I would say.
And I guess to play the devil's advocate slightly, is are there natural conflicts? Are there tensions, if you like?
I mean, I think the question that I do sometimes ask, it's almost the question of, is this a zero-sum game in terms of, you know, does there have to be a reallocation of resources? It's probably quite a philosophical one to go to. So I think there are tensions because, for example, I think, so for example, in a lot of organisations here in the UK, where you've got, say, for example, a leadership that, you know, is maybe, you know, male, middle class, white, etc., they may be thinking to themselves, you know, if I support this here D&I thing, you know, I'm potentially disadvantaging my son who looks like me, for example, right? And I think that does create almost like a sort of like natural tension. So there is something about how we go about this work, whether we're internal or external consultants, how we go about this work in a way that helps people see that it is fair, it is equitable, and that the needs of different groups are reflected. I don't know whether that answers your question, Mac.
I think it does, and I think you raise a really good question around resource allocation. That's something we can potentially get onto a little bit later. Simon, was there anything you wanted to add from kind of a contrast perspective or a tension perspective?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of build on some of Cheryl's points, but I can just see Liz in the chat, just in terms of actually that EDI conversation that we're having at work, and, you know, getting the buy-in, getting the allyship, and people really understanding. And I think we talk a lot about in this space about bringing your whole self to work and getting that sense of belonging, you know, which is what we want to kind of achieve. And most organisations, you know, have a plan and, you know, kind of focus around this. But I think to Liz's point, what then happens outside of the workplace, and then, you know, and does that behavior or attitude change, in various ways. And I suppose actually, how do we bring some of those two worlds together so they don't feel separate? And I think a lot of this is around educating. And I think, some of the great examples that we've seen, around allyship and understanding different cultures and different topics in the EDI space, then how can that then influence people's behavior outside of work and maybe the decisions that they're making as well? So really trying to bring, I suppose, those two worlds together. So you've got that sweet spot around some of these topics.
Absolutely. Debbie, I can see you got your hand raised. Did you want to come off mute and ask a question?
No, it's more a reflection. So listening to what everybody's saying is really great, because I'm quite a toddler in this world, really. And our organisation is really in its infancy of taking it really seriously. It's always been done, but not seriously. And the one choice we made quite early on this year was to go with the word inclusion and do that and tackle all areas. So when we say every stone will be unturned, that's for everybody. We want to see everybody's differences. So we're not going to exclude anybody in that. And we've really gone along that route. We're still really early on, but it's helped a little bit, because I put a message in the chat there. So I've lived in Warrington for a long time, and we had a death of a young trans teenager, was stabbed in the park last year, which shook the town really. And I work a lot with youth as well, so this is where I've got this cross conversational now happening. And when it came round to Pride in Warrington this year, the local authority took a decision not to do a parade like all the other towns have done and they've done before, because they didn't want to upset and cause annoyance for those that were not trans, which was really, really odd. It was a lovely day, but it was missing something. It was missing that celebration. It was missing the purpose of that day was. Whereas because of the nature of our work, we operate in 3 different heartlands. So I did 2 others, and they embraced it fully, really local to Warrington. They embraced it fully. It was a great, great day for both. But Warrington missed the trick because they were feared of the backlash should they do something like that. And because that was predominantly made up of youth, and obviously that's the area where I work, I'm finding now there's like a conversation of hate. Hate is rising. So where before you would have, it was quite generational, like your gran might say something, but the real kind of low, the younger generations were a little bit more educated around that, and a little bit more maybe accepting, and a little bit more tolerant, respectful, all of the things you would expect for one another. What I'm finding now is that there is an influence on each. So that same thing you might have heard from your gran, and you'd say, we don't talk that way anymore, Gran. That's not the right way. I'm actually hearing out of the mouths of babes, and they are starting to sound like the population that perhaps we were trying to support with. That isn't the way we want to live anymore, And I'm hearing that in the sort of 20s and 30s, and it's done in an expression of what these things are taking from them. It's as if people are losing something if they support any individual who has any kind of protected characteristic or group. When you hear people speak about refugees, we've got quite a large community in our town, and they use the hotels. The speak about them is about how they're taking their jobs, their homes, their money, their hardship, their vouchers, they're being looked after better than our own. Have you seen the veterans on the street? It's disgraceful. And, when and you live in the world where those facts that they are being fed on social media and wherever those platforms they're feeding that information, yourself that actually that isn't the truth. That isn't really how it happens, because this is the process. I am finding that now, instead of being able to having a normal conversation with individuals of all ages, it's defensive, it's argumentative, you're wrong. There is this real hatefulness rising up, and that has happened really quickly this year.
Absolutely. I guess I was going to ask the panel in kind of that regard, what role do you think kind of social media has played in terms of this whole kind of diversity and inclusion landscape, positives and negatives? What are your views? We'll go to Sheryl first. I think you.
I mean, the algorithm, it's part of the reason. First of all, a few years ago, I came off Facebook. Then a couple of years ago, I came off Instagram. I'm just hanging on to LinkedIn by the skin of my teeth. But the algorithms, unfortunately, going back to Joanne's point about the binary thinking, the algorithms drive that, and the algorithms love the negative, and negative is a stronger emotion anyway for us as humans. So the algorithms absolutely just feed off that hate. And then you throw in politics, we've got elections coming up, all of that stuff, the traditional media. It's kind of a bit of a recipe for, it is just a recipe for hate. As you say, Debbie, some great examples there. And I just wanted to say as well, you said about your organisation being a toddler and starting with inclusion, and it's the right place to start. It's absolutely the right place to start. I just wanted to make that point as well. And that's kind of almost how you can start to counter that sort of divisive narrative, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. Thanks for sharing, Debbie. And it's great to see the work that you're doing. I think young people have such an important critical role to play. So I've definitely seen that turn as well. I mean, I've been in the space similar to you, Sheryl, like 10 years or so, and I think we have had such a focus about, like, as an area, as a kind of a discipline, it has evolved. Like, if you look at kind of DE&I over the last 10 years, it originally started more around policy, and it was much more kind of really around kind of the regulations, and then it has moved along. So there has been a huge focus on diversity, and some of the research that I've been doing in my PhD around inclusion acknowledges that kind of shift around. Actually, it's only started to talk more around inclusion, particularly in like the 2000s, and more kind of in the last kind of 5 years of actually saying it is just as important, if not more important. Whereas before it was always kind of like we have to get diversity right, and then we'll focus on inclusion. But now we know, but as a discipline, I think people are evolving in that space. But I guess some of the damage around that is that there are large groups who feel really, rightly or wrongly, do feel it like they have been excluded, and people's feelings are, they are important, and we have to take that on board. So I've definitely seen more of a shift around inclusion, and I think that is really, really important. I think it will help with that. But the social media, I've got teenagers as well, and some of the things that you see, it's really quite scary actually, and they are influenced. So it is, and they're more likely to listen to their peers or whoever they're following on social media than they are to any of, well, to me anyway, for certain. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done around that, but I do think that focus on inclusion is an important one. We've got to turn that around.
And I think you're right. I think, it's scary what we have seen over the last couple of years, and where we've seen some of the volume in the conversation. And I think, trying to think about, right, how do we use that conversation, that insight to really then open up some of the, focuses that we're all having in our own organisations. Sometimes it can be a case of, very much focusing on the bubble of the organisation, but and not necessarily tapping into what people are exposed to outside of work. Whether that's directly exposed to, whether that's experiences people are having in their day-to-day lives, or actually conversation through, the people that they care for, that, their children, etc. So I think connecting those two is really important, and leaning into some of those conversations, because they are going to have an impact on how colleagues are potentially feeling around their work and around their organisation as well. So it has been disruptive, but also we need to listen and understand that, especially as EDI professionals in some of the jobs that we do.
I was just to add on to that, add on to what Simon was saying. I think there is, one of the things, I think that there are a lot more people that are middle of the road than on the extremes. And actually, if more of us spoke up on social media, and I know it can be difficult because it can be quite a triggering sort of place.
And people don't like it either. Like, how many times, I've tried to have a sensible conversation, and people are just like, no. But actually, people message you privately and say, that's the right thing. So sorry to interrupt, Sheryl, but that's so true.
Totally agree. So if if you've got the stomach for it, if you can speak up and be that voice of reason, and potentially the other thing I would add is throwing in some facts, some facts, figures from like a reputable source. So you sort of say, look, here's the link to such and such an article that explains the facts about this, that, and the other. So we can play a role on social media, but I'm not telling everyone to come off social media, but we can play a role by not just letting the extremes monopolize the conversation. We can add our sort of like more moderate voices into that and share facts and do the and that Joanne was saying. So when you see two sides, if you want to go there and be the referee, you can go in and say, we can value that and we can value something else as well.
It's an interesting one, and I think in your preamble, Sheryl, you said that you are hanging onto LinkedIn by a thread, I guess. Have you seen the tone change in kind of what has traditionally been quite a professional platform? And to give my context, I used to really enjoy LinkedIn. I used to really enjoy the level of conversation, the professionalism, the ability to network. And then over the last couple of years, I've really noticed it start to descend into a little bit of chaos, and it's an environment that I now don't feel as comfortable as I once was. But I'm not sure, to your point earlier, if it's the algorithm that's making it kind of largely negative that I'm being exposed to, or if it's something generally that's true of society and social media.
Well, I mean, LinkedIn is just a reflection of society. I think my daughter said actually the other day, she said LinkedIn is basically Facebook for corporate people. We sometimes say, oh, it's not Facebook. It's the same sort of people, but just they're on LinkedIn in a suit in their profile picture, right? So I think it is I think there is something about, you have to really curate your feed. That's what I tend to do. If I start to feel that it's getting really toxic, I really curate it. I unfollow some people. There's even some people in this D&I space that I have to unfollow, no shade, and I'm not going to name anyone.
Naming and shaming.
No naming and shaming on this webinar. But you have to really curate your feed. And I don't mean you have to create an echo chamber, right? Because it's nice to have debate and different perspectives. But if you can see that, maybe somebody's just is quite toxic and they tend to, maybe go for people personally and all, I'm not a big fan of those sorts of things. And then those are the people that I tend to unfollow.
Yeah, and I see Liz has kind of made a comment to that point that you just raised there, in terms of not wanting to create an echo chamber and trying to follow people with different views and perspectives. I guess, how do you do that in a way that is either safe to you or is kind of getting you the benefit of having both sides of the dialogue without necessarily leaning too far into problematic territory?
I mean, for me, it's the tone with which the challenge comes. So for me, it's I'm not really into personal insults and attacks from either side. So this is, what I mean? I will, if I kind of see that sort of content, so if it's very sort of base level, I tend not to like it, but I don't mind comments from either side of the debate. Because as D&I professionals, you've got to be able to walk that line anyway. When you walk into organisations, you will meet people from every side of the political and social spectrum. So you've got to be able to, debate and discuss with either. But for me, it just has to come with a level of, kind of respectful, kind of courteous and polite way of putting things across. When people start to get into throwing insults, I'm out, basically.
Yeah.
Certainly on social media. Yeah.
Agree. I think that's the like, somebody can say, oh, actually, I've got a different point of view in that, or I don't really agree. This is my point of view. Like, you can say that, as opposed to somebody saying, what a load of X, and all these like exclamation marks, or what are you talking about, or just complete insults, which I, like you, don't engage in that. I think it's I don't have time for that. I think like we want to engage, and we want to be able to create change and do that in a way that is meaningful, and those conversations are just not people, in that sense, they're not out to actually really understand what is it, and being there with an open mind around learning. you know, I'm happy to have conversations and debate, but there's a difference between that debate and insult slinging. But yeah.
And actually part of the skill, especially when you have, you know, two extreme views, there is a real skill to knowing how to bring those, you know, both sides to the table and find the common ground such that it starts to become a healthy conversation rather than just polarized. So if you do get into the trap of, you know, the insults and all of that, it's not going to go anywhere anyway. People just become more entrenched. So yeah, finding people that you can, you know, spar with in a healthy way that have different views, that for me is the key. And that's the essence of what we often have to do when we go into organisations, especially when there is backlash and resistance.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just facilitating some of that as well. And I think, you know, a huge part of connecting somebody, you know, we all talk about, you know, broadening our network and connecting with new people, but absolutely supporting those people you connect with as well. So actually, if you do see something that maybe is getting out of hand, you know, how can you then step in and support and be that person that maybe guides the conversation in a different way? So I think we've also got to remember the impact of some of these negative comments or behaviours that we see on some of these social media platforms and how that individual might then feel away from the screen as well. So I think, you know, the more that we can do to support that, the better. And I think, Matt, you know, in terms of your kind of question there, and, you know, thinking about your network, how do you keep on evolving your network? So actually then when you're evolving, you're having different conversations, connecting with people, absolutely will have an impact on your feed as well. So really thinking about that kind of diverse network to make sure that, you know, your feed is the right feed for you and how that evolves over time.
Absolutely. I can see a lot of comments in the chat. Thank you. Please do continue. Liz, I can see you've got your hand up. Was there a question that you wanted to ask?
It wasn't a question. It was just to say on the point around interacting with people who have different views. One of my personal kind of intentions this year has been how to develop my capacity to be curious. So to ask curious questions rather than like really directly challenging questions. So like, can you tell me what you mean by that? And how do you think we could work together to create a space where, you know, blah, 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 blah. And I think that that's something I'm probably going to have to continue into 2024 with my learning, but it has really helped me to deal with some of the more challenging questions or assumptions that people have made around difference, really.
Absolutely, and I'm a massive advocate of that, you know, questioning out of curiosity and a willingness to want to know more, to expand your horizons, to actually learn what it is that people are saying from a different perspective. You know, we can only really truly appreciate our own lived experience, but through conversations we can dig in a little bit deeper to people's viewpoints and perspectives. And I'm not sure if there's anything you wanted to add, Joanne, from your academic background, and obviously I know that you're doing a related PhD.
No, I think not necessarily on the topic of the kind of the socials. I just think that that my PhD I'm doing is really around privilege and understanding leaders' understanding of privilege. So basically, if a leader can self-conceptualize their own privilege, so therefore they recognize where they lack privilege and where they have privilege, are they more likely to include others at work or not? And I think there is that real, I think there was some talk around like just understanding yourself. I think somebody put it in the chat, but I think this piece around having that time to understand like your own identity and who you are, and you know, sometimes people, like you said, Sheryl, about how do we make sure we include everybody? How do we make sure that this is about everybody, all of us, every single person, including people who we would often associate in the majority group, like a white man who you know, able-bodied, straight, who went to private school. They will have had, you know, challenges in their lives. There will be different parts of their identity that they may choose to share or not that influence who they are. And I think the more that we give people the space and acknowledge and don't make assumptions about each other, that then the more likely that we are to step into other people's shoes. So we understand ourselves, our own identity, and we then are able to and feel respected for our identity. We don't feel defensive about who we are and have to apologise for that. We're much more likely, from what I've read and in my work as a practitioner, to then be more open to being curious and understanding, okay, well, what's it like for you in the organisation? And then importantly, link that to, so how does that impact how people navigate the workplace? Are there barriers in places? Are there advantages in places for some groups over others? And if there are, what can I do as a leader to start to dismantle some of that? Because I know that when I do that, I'm going to make benefits for everybody, because this is about inclusion for all. I think that's a really important part of it, and it all links into it.
I just add on to that, just Max, sorry, just to link back to what Liz was saying as well about how to challenge on social media, because in what Joanne was saying there, I think there is something about, if, for example, if you read, a view on, say, LinkedIn that you disagree with or vehemently disagree with, I think there is that thing about, there's a famous quote, isn't there? Listen first to understand rather than to reply. And I think there is something about really trying to get in the head of the person that has that view first, to make sure that we really understand it. And then I would say, my tip, some people might say I sit on the fence quite a lot on LinkedIn when I'm making comments and things, but one of my tips would be, don't go straight for the jugular, in terms of don't start with I disagree with that, because there are other ways to kind of go in quite softly, even if you do disagree. And going back to what Joanne was saying towards the top of the webinar, using that word "and" is sometimes helpful, actually, when you want to offer in a different perspective. So you don't even necessarily have to say, I disagree with what you've just said. You could start with a and you just then give your perspective, right? And that's a kind of just a softer way of challenging, and it doesn't get their back up because you haven't started with, I disagree with what you're saying, which they sometimes read as, you're not an intelligent person or whatever it might be, right? That's how we all respond to things.
I think there is something to be said around kind of context, and what I've observed from social media is that people often talk to other people in a way that they never would in real life. I think that sometimes the aggression, the tones that people use are just absolutely not in keeping with, if you're in person with someone, if you're in the room having a conversation, you'd probably be a little bit more tactful in terms of exploring people's opinions and views and perspectives, rather than just immediately jumping on what someone said.
Wild. The wild west.
Absolutely. I think it's the keyboard warrior dynamic. Katrina, I can see you've got your hand up. Did you want to ask a question to the panel?
Yes, I did. Thanks for having us all. I am running what I think is going to be a one-day kind of session on how to integrate more inclusive thinking and practices into an organization near me. And to the point that Sherry made about being on the offensive, I find often when I address those groups, I have to start by saying that this is not a them versus us kind of thing. But I don't have as much time as I would like. So my question is, how do I set the housekeeping at the beginning of the session with the language that says what Joanne said quite nicely, which is, there are other perspectives that we're trying to include. It's not a them versus us, because I'm going to be honest, it's a very WASP dynamic. It's a very white Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of dynamic. And yes, I'm being brought in to be a bit of a disruptor, to change minds and include different perspectives. But if you get them on the back foot at the beginning, it doesn't go through. So I'd like to start the sessions with a bit of kind of psychological housekeeping, but I need help with the language about how to do that, so that people come with their full selves and they don't think that they're being set upon for sometimes through no fault of their own, which is that they were born white, male, and rich. So that was my question. I have another one, but I'll wait for other people to have conversation first.
Amazing. And I've never heard that acronym before, WASP. Yeah, thank you. Anyone got views on that? How to kind of set that context and set that scene for people to feel included?
I think just a short thing from me. I think, like, even if you saw at the beginning, like the way that you had set up, Mac, the kind of one slide, like that's what I've done in the past, is like, it's almost like a contract, but the add to that, I would say, that I've found really helpful is, so that the group doesn't feel that that's been done to them, is, this is your space, this is your meeting, I'm here to facilitate a conversation, I'm not going to talk at you, and here are some of the guidelines and some things that we can look at that will make sure that we have a better conversation. Do you agree with these? And is there anything that you would like to add to these? because then they become that they are theirs, as opposed to, and sometimes they will add to it, and sometimes they won't, and then if they haven't, they've at least had the opportunity to say to you whether you agree. You haven't gone in and just assumed, here, we're going to do this and let's move forward. So that would be one thing I would say to consider.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I guess as you do this sort of work, you all develop your own sort of slides and your own types of things that you like to say. I always say, linking back to what Simon was saying, I always say that I'm there to facilitate and not to dictate, because even though you've been brought in because you've got additional knowledge and whatever, but you don't want, like Joanne was saying, you don't want people to feel as though it's being done to them, that they're being forced to go into yet another D&I session because the last 4 didn't work or whatever. So it's coming up with that language, and then I use terms around, a bit like Mac did, around it being a safe space. I actually try to give people as much permission to say whatever they feel they need to say, as long as it's said in a respectful way. But I kind of say, it's a learning environment, so please, I actually encourage, things like awkward questions, and hence probably why I sometimes, will get people talking about Jordan Peterson and all sorts of things, because actually it's a space where they feel that maybe they weren't allowed to before, even though they held those views. And it is really important that you create a space where people can say those things, in a kind of respectful way.
Yeah. And then just to build on that, I think that's why at TEG, we talk a lot, not just about the safe space, but you would have seen on that slide the brave space as well, to really kind of encourage, the input from everybody within the room, but also to how they feel comfortable doing that. So there'll be some people in the room that will want to actively take part and join in the conversation. There'll be some that will just reflect and maybe, chip in towards the end of the conversation as well. So I suppose, really kind of being respectful for the different types of people within the room, but really kind of focusing on making sure that we're kind of listening and we're understanding, people's experiences. And for some people, it will be a really brave thing to do, to speak up and to talk about themselves and to talk about past experience. And we've really got to kind of acknowledge that within the room. So I think a lot of that is around the behaviour. And I do think, it's a really good point that you mentioned. How you set that scene sets the tone for the rest of the meeting or the workshop, whatever you're delivering with that group of individuals.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that kind of from a human perspective. I think we tend to, at the Equal Group, kind of taper people into conversation. So if it's a really intense subject that you're talking about, you might want to start with something like an icebreaker, to just allow people to get used to sharing their views, their opinions, perspectives. And internally at the Equal Group, we do icebreakers on a weekly basis, just to lighten the mood slightly, because I think it can be quite an expectation to want people to really just start dealing with some intense subject matter straight away. So you kind of need to warm them up to actually the psychology around how do we have more of an open conversation on a topic that's quite light. And kind of.
Sorry, I was just going to add. I think it's the house rules, but also to pick up on what you were saying, Mac, and also Simon. It's some of it's the facilitation techniques. So there are different techniques that are, less threatening, less scary, more psychologically safe. So in terms of how the information is delivered, so even if the upfront house rules hasn't quite landed, I've definitely seen you can still bring a group together and really get them to open up, even if they've maybe been quiet at the start, just by using different types of facilitation techniques. So that's the other thing that I mentioned as well.
Amazing. And I wanted to kind of switch tack slightly to talk more around organizations and what we've seen over the last year or so that has really impressed us in terms of innovation, or companies leaning in, doing things slightly different. You don't necessarily have to name the organizations, but I guess what have you seen in this diversity and inclusion space that has really stood out for you? Open question. I'm not sure who wants to go first. Is there anything? Should we? Yeah, go on.
I mean, I guess where I'd sort of start with, I think, because organisations have been doing this for a while, right? Most organisations, and certainly since 2020, a lot more. So there was the stat that you quoted there at the start. I think the one thing that I am seeing in terms of for organisations that are taking this agenda seriously is some commitment to a very rigorous or robust framework, right? And I don't just mean like a box ticking kind of, PR type thing that you then suddenly get a badge, on your website or something. But for example, I've seen a couple of organisations move to say a B Corp status, right? So something like that, where they're really quite holistically showing commitment to, and it's typically not just this agenda, it's the whole ESG agenda, so kind of climate responsibility and all of those sorts of things. So so that I'm quite liking, because I think it links to, I think somebody submitted a question around accountability and how does the organisation make sure that it holds itself accountable both internally and externally. So I think something like commitment to what is quite a high sort of like ethical standard is a good way that organisations can show that they're serious.
Yeah. I think one thing that really stands out is that, we can see now, by having some of these conversations with clients, so they're starting to close the loop. And I think, what I mean by that, I think what we've seen historically is, yes, we might go and do an audit or a survey or hold a listening group, but then what? And we know the action is key, and we've spoken about the action, but I think closing the loop is equally as important. So going back to those colleagues, going back to certain groups of individuals and really saying, around how we've used that insight, that conversation, that data to then produce a certain action. And then also reviewing that action as well. So talking to those people, say, actually, has that made a difference? How do you now feel about coming to work, the organisation or the line manager conversations that you're having? And I think the more that, companies can close that loop and really think about the benefits of it, it will then build that momentum. So definitely seen more of an emphasis on going back and really reviewing and talking to colleagues.
Yeah. And I would just add to those points as well around I think some of the things where I've seen it works really well is about having this sustainable plan, the keeping going when other priorities come up, as they do, really making sure that there is a clear plan that is owned by leadership, but is then really cascaded throughout the whole. I think somebody mentioned in the chat, it is through every single the employee life cycle, all of the decisions from onboarding to attraction to right the way through to progression, promotion, and employee engagement. But it is about having, one where I've seen it worked well, where you've seen that measurable change, is where you're really focusing on the impact that's been made. So not just lots of stuff, but actually, to your point, Sam, like how does that all link together? But also having targets, and when I say targets, I don't mean quotas. It's always about the right people in the role. So having targets that they hold themselves accountable for internally and externally, and then measuring those targets and linking that to pay. So where, leaders will get, it doesn't have to be a negative, it doesn't have to be about taking away. Where I've seen is where people will actually get an extra where they can demonstrate that they have really been focusing on DE&I and they've made a progress on that they actually get rewarded for that. I think that's a really important part of it. So I think targets are key, because what we measure gets on the agenda. And then the other thing I would say is that there is the focus on the behavioural piece as well, because it's not enough to have the targets and it's not enough to just focus on the diversity. Where organisations, and I've worked with, so we really look at what is the culture, what are the behaviours, what are the values, what do we want, what is acceptable and what is not, what do we want our people to be, the experience that they have. How do we measure that, and how do we really hold ourselves accountable if that doesn't happen? Because our people will see that, they will know, and that's where you send a symbol to the people. So I think sometimes in these people want like this big, they did this big program, or they did this, this invested this, and actually that isn't what's going to change the experience. It's not what's going to change the culture. What will change is when you are actually looking at your pipeline on a line by line basis, and that you're turning the numbers into names. You're not saying I've got 10 people on that list. You know their names, you know who sponsors them, you know whether they've been promoted, if not, why not, when. that's the stuff that will create change. And where organizations do that, that's where I've seen that's really good. I'm not interested in the shiny stuff, because that's not going to, it's important to have symbols and to invest, but also do the hard work.
And also it's a slow burn, you know. It's really not overnight, you know, and even for very small organizations, and I typically work with, you know, sometimes, you know, a couple of hundred people, and even in those this stuff doesn't change overnight. But that's not to say, and just there was a point in the chat that's not to say that things aren't getting better. Things are getting better. They're still not good enough. Right, but the facts are there. You know, I was looking at some of the Parker Review stats, for example, and Joanne will know more about these than me. But in the Parker Review stats, you know, in 2017, in the FTSE 100, something like, if I get this wrong, Joanne, please jump in, but something like just over half of the FTSE 100 didn't have a single director from a minority ethnic background, right? So just over half, pretty much about half. And in 2023, there were only 6 FTSE 100 companies that did not have a director. Now, I'm not going to say that none of them are token hires, and I'm not going to say that it's all perfect and all of that stuff. But, you know, progress is being made, but it's very slow. But a lot of this stuff is very slow, because actually we talk about changing culture. You know, there's a famous saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So we can write as many D&I strategies as we want. If the culture isn't right, and more importantly, probably if the leadership aren't on board, it's going nowhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to reflect on that and what Joanne shared, you know, for me, it's about the simple things, getting the simple things right. Some of that is about honesty, you know, being honest about where you are and where you've struggled. I think there's also something to be said about red lines. So, you know, what will you do? What won't you do? And what does that mean? Not just from an employee perspective, but also who you work with, who you partner with, who you take on as clients. I think there's so much work to be done in terms of understanding the full extent of the commitments that you're making. And then to your earlier point, Sheryl, I think, you know, leading with inclusion. I think if you keep inclusion at the heart of what you're doing, and I'm you know, very similar to you, Sheryl, in terms of it's not the big shiny stuff that wins awards and you know, gets accolades, but it's about stuff you do on a day-to-day basis, the culture, how you really meaningfully embed this. There was a question from Douglas in the chat that I wanted to kind of touch on. So what is really happening to move things on? Are we just helping to keep the circle going? I wanted to use that as a kind of a segue into what are the things that you've seen that have been not so positive in terms of you know, the trend, the dynamic across 2023.
I mean, for me, it's that you know, the gap between what you say and what you do. So, you know, lots of kind of signaling around what will be done, but not actually, if you really get down and measure the change, you're not seeing that. You know, we've seen lots of organizations make commitments, but actually, and I see this quite a bit because I see it all the time where people make these grand commitments and bold statements, and people get very excited about them. But actually, when you really drill into what does that actually mean, what does that, because you can throw percentages around and make it look big, and when it's not. So I think that can be disappointing, where if it's more of a marketing ploy and it is just about kind of having that doing it for the sake of being seen to do it, as opposed to that's the right thing to do. On the flip side, I see a lot of organizations doing great things that actually they don't shout about, that they should do more of. So I think quite often the ones that are really doing a lot of work don't necessarily look up and shout out. So I think that's something for them to do more on. But I think that's a big thing, because the gap between what you say and what you do. If people just did what they said they were going to do, we would have, well, I wouldn't have a job anyway. So.
And just part of that, you know, is obviously around, you know, resource and having, you know, the right people enrolled. And I think, you know, what we've seen over the last year, unfortunately, for some organisations, and actually, we've seen reducing in structures or in ED&I roles coming out of certain organisations, or when people leave have not been replaced. And, there is definitely a watch out around that. And some of that is around some of the context and people trying to think about, right, what's the best position to be in. And for some organisations, it is an opportunity to really thinking about that accountability piece. But actually, when you're taking that talent out of a certain structure or group, really trying to think about, right, okay, how is that then replaced? How do we get that expertise, that understanding and that knowledge to really drive that strategy forward? So it is definitely a risk that we've seen over the last year, but there are different mechanics in terms of how do you counteract that, but make sure that void or that gap is filled in the right way. And that could be filled short term, because that's the right decision to do for the right organisation. But equally longer term, if you really want to make traction, you've got to make sure that you've got the right kind of plan in place with the right accountability to still deliver that ED&I strategy part of that people plan or your business plan as well.
Yeah, to sort of add on to what Simon was saying, I mean, it kind of links to resource in terms of definitely having the right resource, because I think going right back to what Debbie was saying at the top of this, I think what I'm seeing certainly with some leadership teams is there's a fear, so this work takes a lot of bravery, and sometimes there's a fear as a result of either what's seen out in the media or that kind of like low level resistance that starts to come up, that the leadership team start to hear, that then causes D&I to sort of fall down the list of priorities. But also it's really interesting. I had a conversation with an ERG, so a staff network, in the run up to Black History Month, and they were getting pushback on a sponsorship program. So they were wanting to implement a sponsorship program for employees from an African Caribbean background, and they were getting pushback, and they could see that it was really starting to sway the sponsor. But when it was interesting in the conversation that we had, I sort of challenged and said, well, who are you putting forward for sponsorship? Because there is something about, we've got to remember the legalities of things like, positive action, positive discrimination, all of those sorts of things. We've got the RAF case, this year. So there are people that are almost like validly raising concerns around almost like unfair access, just because, for example, the colour of somebody's skin. So I sort of said my advice, in that instance, and it's something that I say to a lot of staff networks, is if you want to do something like a sponsorship or a mentoring program, pick your high potentials, pick your high potentials that don't typically have access to the leadership team, that maybe have got that protected characteristic, and do it that way, rather than, having the rest of the organisation almost like looking on and saying, oh, you're literally being advantaged and given leadership access because of the colour of your skin or because of your gender or because of, and there's a whole conversation around who does and doesn't have access to sponsorship. But still, in the way that D&I is done, it has to be done in a way that is equitable and is seen to be equitable as well. And I use the word equitable sort of deliberately, but I think there's something in the way that we go about this work, that it's done in a way that doesn't attract criticism almost like for the sake of it, in the way that we go about it. Yeah,
I think that's a really important point in terms of the way the work gets done and who's doing the work. And I guess I wanted to come back to you there, Sheryl, in terms of the skill sets that are needed, or that the professional development. And Simon, you made a really good point there in terms of organizations being specific about the resources that they need, both in the short and longer term. So I guess, what are your observations around individuals, the types of individuals are seeing in this space, and the qualities needed to really do this work in a meaningful way? You mentioned bravery as being one of them. I guess, are there any more?
I think it sort of follows the maturity that organizations have gone through. So I think if you think back to sort of like, 2020, sort of post George Floyd, organizations were right at the start, and actually there was a lot of performative stuff, and actually they needed to hear about the lived experience of what their employees were going through. And I think therefore you then had a lot of people moving to this space based on their lived experience, and that sort of work is important to moving people along, the D&I maturity. So I think now we're moving more into a space where actually the work is getting harder, right? The low-hanging fruit's been picked. People get why this is important. They're now trying to figure out the how. And so it's the skill set that we talked about, the facilitation, quite skilled facilitation, being able to walk the line between quite polarized views and actually teaching managers how to do that, and how to sort of like consult and engage with organizations. So the skill set is changing because the maturity in terms of where organizations are is changing, right? And the challenges are different, is what I would say.
And having the resilience as well, in order to navigate some of those challenging conversations, because it is naturally getting harder. And therefore, I suppose if you've got an ED&I manager or you're an ED&I manager, how are you getting support? How are you supporting others? To make sure that there isn't that burnout. And I think I've had quite a lot of conversations over the last year where maybe teams have reduced. It's now just one individual within an organisation. How does that feel? How does it feel to have that burden on their shoulder, as some of them call it? Because actually, there's a lot that they're having to face into. So I suppose, yes, we're looking for resilience, with some of these roles, but also how can everybody play their part in supporting and thinking about people's well-being? Because as we all know, a lot of these conversations are really hard to face into, and therefore, as I say, that risk of burnout is really high.
Yeah. And if you don't mind, just adding on, Max, I think it's an important part of it, because I agree, like the piece around the bravery, the navigating different conversations, the piece that you've said, Simon, around the importance of resilience is really important, but also things like having a strategic mindset, having business acumen, having knowledge of finance, being analytical, being comfortable with data manipulation, depending on what role you're in, I'm writing board papers, I'm presenting to the senior leadership team, I'm advising executive leaders, I could be building out a pack, I could be facilitating a set, I could be doing, something here and here. I have to be operational, I have to be strategic, I have to be empathetic, I have to lead the team, and also you have to, if I did everything that I wanted to do as an activist, there would be other things that I would be doing. You have to be able to put a business hat on and say what's right for the business. Having the heart, having the lived experience is really important, but also you have to be able to think about, is the business ready? Can we do that right now? If not now, when? So I do think there's a whole piece around really credentializing this space, which at the moment isn't. It's difficult. There are people at all levels, and then that means organisations put different values on it, which I don't think is right either. Sorry, it's a bugbear, Max, so I had to jump in.
Not at all. Really, really helpful. Thank you. And Katrina and Debbie, I can see you've got your hands up. I will come to you shortly. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm just trying to weave everything in. There's, as you can imagine, a lot to unpick and unpack. I guess kind of going forward, looking at 2024 and beyond, what are your hopes? What are your aspirations? What do you want to see more of? How can we really inject some life back into this space? And I'll go to you first, Sheryl.
I mean, I would build definitely on what Joanne says in terms of, I think within the profession, it would be great to see the profession lift itself. I think in terms of the skills, the skill set, the knowledge, it is hard because it's a very, very fast moving area. I mean, literally this morning I was sat on a webinar, a very academic webinar actually around like social capital, because these things are literally like cutting edge. We're just learning so quickly. So I think definitely something about the industry becoming more professional, whether it be through credentials or just, things like this and kind of learning from each other. I think there will be more focus on employee resource groups, which some people know that I'm putting quite a lot of focus on, because I think as I see resources being pulled away, unfortunately, from the D&I professionals, I see a lot more organisations relying on volunteers, doing this on top of very busy day jobs. And so that's why I've kind of, as Simon was saying, often we are almost like the therapists sometimes when we go into organisations, because you've got literally one or two people trying to do this on the side of their desk. And I see that increasing more as a trend. So something like, 90% of US companies have ERGs. And I think that's only going to increase more here in the UK. So for me, I'm kind of like, yeah, how do we skill up D&I professionals, and how do we skill up these people that have volunteered or been voluntold that they have to now run a staff network?
Amazing. Joanne?
Yeah, I mean, I agree around the whole piece of the what Sheryl says. And then I think in addition to that, I think what I'd like to see is just more braver action from organizations actually like moving along in terms of what needs to happen. And I think that, I don't think that's easy. That takes investment, it takes time, it takes strong leadership to do that. So I think that's what I would like to see, more of that accountability sitting with leaders that are really like driving it forward then, and seeing more, in terms of what that looks like, is like seeing best practice, seeing some examples of, when you ask this question at the end of next year, Mac, and you say like what organizations are doing really well, that we're all, as Simon, can't get ourselves off mute quick enough because there's so many things that we've got to think about and share, whereas that isn't always the case. So that would be my hope.
Absolutely. Simon, same question.
I was to say, just to build on some of that sentiment there, that there is so much to do, isn't there? And I think, that's kind of what we hear about in terms of, the mounting being huge decline, but it's those important steps that, companies are making, but also having the time to really reflect and recognize the steps that, companies and organizations are moving forwards. And, for me, and the conversations that we often have at TEG is, really about taking time to learn from those experiences, because the EDI calendar is so full. The priorities on the company's plan, there's a lot to be achieved, but actually just taking time to reflect and understand where those learnings are coming from and how you can take those learnings. And some of those learnings will be for EDI kind of focuses direct. Some of those learnings may be, for the people function to really understand around how that can support that part of the strategy. But most importantly, within that colleague life cycle, we've spoken about that already, how important that is. So, let's do some more kind of touch points where it is around reflection, it's around learning, and then thinking about what that corrective action could be.
Just to add on something Simon said there about the calendar, because and I'm picking a couple of comments in the chat. There is, especially with more of the emphasis being put on, say for example, staff networks, there's a danger that we slip back into D&I becoming about awareness days and history months, and all that stuff's great, but it's not really going to move the dial in terms of, equal access to progression and opportunity. So there is something about, really planning and linking back to something Joanne said in terms of, we don't want to be within organizations. This is, you don't want people to be almost like busy fools. That quote, the work there has to be like a proper plan, and it has to be, heading somewhere, and it has to be outcome focused. And so that's, one thing that I'd love to see, more rigor around the process of change in these organizations.
Yeah, and it's got to connect, hasn't it? I think, a colleague in any organisation has got to understand why there's a focus. And actually, the minute that you go and focus on an event that actually doesn't connect back to any type of plan or any type of conversation, it then comes into play around questioning why we're doing this, what's the benefit. So being really clear around, to your point, Sheryl, the rigour of that and that decision-making is critical.
Absolutely, really great answers. I'm going to share my thoughts in a second and share the screen to do so. And Katrina and Debbie, I can see you've got your hands up, and I will come to you in roughly 3 or 4 minutes. If there are any other questions that anyone has, please do pop them in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll come to you in a second. So in terms of 2024, when thinking about this from a kind of the equal group perspective, we really started to think about kind of the way in which organizations can move towards more actionable progress. And I think the first point from our perspective is to gather the data. So we are a data-driven organization. We want to see more data, more meaningful data. And when we talk about data, we're talking about it from both a quantitative and qualitative lens. So it's not just about the numbers, but also about people's experiences, how they interact with the organization, either internally or externally. I think it's important for there to be a significant amount of innovation in this space, and part of that comes from knowing your organizational context. So there's things that you do as an organization that is unique to you, unique to your sector, unique to your, the size of your organization, the journey that you've been on. You will have your own unique selling points. So it's really about leaning into that and making equality, diversity and inclusion, equity, diversity and inclusion fit for your purposes. Really important for there to be a greater sense of community, and I can see that coming through some of the comments. So how do we create communities around what we do, either levels of the organization? To Sheryl's point, if there are ERGs or employee network groups that people are involved in, how do we create communities there where people can have conversations, can explore and journey along that curiosity? And then to Simon's point, understanding what that longer term planning looks like for EDI professionals, understanding what continuous professional development really looks like, career planning. To Cheryl's point, this space is changing quite significantly. How do we ensure that people are equipped to continue down this kind of journey, understand the evolution for them? So if you are entry level in terms of EDI, how do you progress to becoming kind of more senior in your role, becoming more confident and competent? So we've got some practical tips for people to take away. As an organisation, we try as much as possible to support people that are doing this work, but also people that have an interest. Do get in touch if you would like a free consultation with us, where we can dig a little bit deeper into your context. We've got a wealth of resources available on our website for you to download free of charge. Might charge you later, so hurry and get them while they're still free. And also just contact us for more information, more suggestions. We're always looking to tap into what people want to see more of from us, conversation you want us to have. If there's topics that you're grappling with that you want us to explore, we would be more than happy to do that. And then for people with a general interest, as kind of a point was made earlier, the EDI calendar can be quite weighty. So we've got an EDI calendar that you can download free of charge again on our website. Tune into these webinars. They're really a good chance for us to understand what people are thinking about, talking about, issues that we need to explore and feed into the work we do on a day-to-day basis. It's really important to lean into allyship. So mentioning kind of communities, how do we support people if we're not actively involved in this work on a day-to-day basis? How do we create space for people to share their views, and also just build up more of a sense of community, cohesion, understanding different perspectives and views, and also empowering people. And then finally, please do tell your friends, colleagues, we're here to support and guide. We also do have an impact model. So there's a great resource on our website that kind of breaks this down for you to understand your context. So it starts with imagining what you want to do, being prepared to understand the data that you need to collect to understand where you are now, and also the future impact of that work. Preparation, so planning out the resources and the logistics around that. Acting, so probably the most meaningful part of any EDI approach is the actions you take, the behaviours that you demonstrate on a day-to-day basis. There's a comms piece in there as well in terms of how you communicate this work, how you invite people in. Communication is a two-way dialogue, so it's about understanding people's views as well as you as an organisation, communicating with others. And the final piece is really tracking, so how much progress are you making, how quickly are you making that progress, and what further needs to be done. So we're going to launch a quick poll now, and as I said, I'm going to open this conversation up into questions and answers, so please do feed in your questions in the chat or raise your hand. We'll give you about a minute to complete that, and we'll take it from there. Amazing. Thank you for those of you that completed that. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I will invite, I think, Katrina, you had your hand up first.
Thanks. The more I listen, the more I think that this might be a free consultation privately kind of question, but in the event that the issue affects other people, I wanted to throw it out there. For those of us who have portfolio careers like myself, I work in comms by day and I work in the live corporate event space by night. And while this space tends to help corporate structures, the events management space is a little bit more of the Wild West, a lot more freelancers. And honestly, I can say that it's an industry that's never heard of DE&I. And the question I submitted when I signed up for the webinar was, how do you leverage being first and only as something that can be a good thing while trying to drag people along who, unlike Debbie, who is a toddler, who they're not even born when it comes to the DE&I space. What do I mean by that? In the hierarchy of shows, usually my name is the second one. And usually it's 30 or 40 very skilled techs who have to do what I say, basically, to execute what is required. I am always the only woman. I'm always the only Black person. And it's an industry that will tell you, oh, we get along fine with everyone, but they're not the ones that are dealing with the microaggressions. They're not the ones dealing with the production managers who talk over and around me as if I'm not there. And the crew that has to say, but she's the boss, you have to talk to her first, kind of thing. I enjoy working there, but how do I find the sweet spot? It's also a very fast-paced industry, just to put that out there. So people literally do not have the physical time to sit down and analyze how people have felt about a show. Most people are just off a plane from Davos and they're going to something at the Excel, and maybe they'll get something to eat before they head back to Birmingham to run something. So that's a large part of it as well. And I've heard all the talk about, yeah, we'll address this with clients and we don't want you to feel that way on jobs. But when it comes down to it, they want to get their invoices paid, sign off on the show, and make sure that this client books them again for the next big conference, whenever it is. So I quite enjoy being the representation of what is possible, that there are Black immigrant females who can have the language to lead teams that are technical in a space that is as white and male as Parliament, I suppose. But on the other hand, it is very lonely when points need to be made about the way I'm treated on shows and there's literally no sounding board. There are women who are very kind to me and they are empathetic, but fundamentally they're rich white women and their experience still is not quite the same as mine. It's kind of like when Elaine Welteroth talked about being the first and the only when she became the first Black editor of Vogue. She said that's kind of a lonely place because, yeah, you're there and you represent this thing that can happen, you're aspirational, but then you have no infrastructure around you to bring people along with you and to change mindsets. So like I said, I don't want to leave the industry. I very much enjoy it. I get great satisfaction from it. But the microaggressions are starting to become, they're not the death of a thousand cuts anymore. They're just cutting really deep. And finding that sweet spot, even if we don't handle it on this call, I'd like to follow up with you later to find out how to manage it. Because like I said, this industry doesn't have the time nor the interest in conversations like the ones we're having now.
Yeah,
a lot to dig into there.
Yeah, I'll just throw out something really quickly. So first of all, I think there is something about how do individuals get that support, especially when they're in industries like that. And I think any industry that uses a lot of freelancers, contracts and all that sort of thing to come together for a project and then to disperse, you will get a lot of that. I think the first thing I thought of was, where is your network? So are there any networks either within your industry or in related? So I'd maybe go to, is there a related industry that's got a network for women or for Black individuals? That's where I'd be looking. And if the answer is no, maybe you create one, right? Maybe you create that.
Sorry, but here's where we talk about the unpaid psychological labor of Black women. 100%. I just want to make my money and go 100%, home.
100%, I know. And the other thing that I was going to suggest as well, both myself and Max sit on a board of an organisation that, runs events, has people on stage. And one thing that organisations can start to do, but again, this is the sweat equity, right? There's something about organisations can have charters in terms of the way that their contractors, partners, suppliers, etc., should work. So in terms of industry change, and it's not going to happen overnight, and I understand that you're one individual, but things like that, a charter for how freelancers, contractors, suppliers, etc., should operate, and the standards to which they want to hold individuals to is something that can be used. I know that there are quite a few venues and other places that have that sort of thing. It's really making those things aware and holding people to account. But if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn afterwards and we carry on the conversation, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, likewise, happy to speak after this. There's a lot to unpack there. Debbie, going to come to you next.
Sorry, mine's really to say thank you, because after listening to that, I feel quite inspired, you know, that whole webinar, because I was taken on, I think. So I applied for the role. It was a 6-month project. Sorry.
I think we're all happy to hear that you're feeling inspired, Debbie. That's that's
yeah,
the result. That's the result, because this work's hard. It's hard work. You know, back to Katrina's point, it's hard work, especially when you feel as though you're the only one. So yeah. So if we fill somebody's cup even just a little bit, pleased.
It was brilliant, because I think all of the things that we're looking for 2024 is where we're heading as an organisation. I think initially it was do this 6-month project to prove to everybody that we are inclusive, we do EDI. And when I looked in, and I'm the individual, I think as well, they thought Deb gets it done, she'll sort it out. But actually I was able to turn the tables back at the exec team and say, actually, we're not. And we've opened that can now. So it was a 6-month role. It was increased for another year. And the plan now is hopefully it'll be permanent. So amazing. Everything that we're doing are all of the things that we spoke about. And for 2024 the same. So I feel really high-spirited from listening to it all, thinking, like, at least, like I say, we're a toddler, but at least I know I'm in the right place and space.
That's amazing to hear. Thank you so much for sharing. And that's the intention of this space. We want people to come in and feel inspired. We want people to come in, learn. And do please keep close. So we've got some webinars planned for next year. We will continue to put out our bi-weekly newsletter. So please do engage. If there's anything that you want to speak to us about, our contact details should be coming up in the chat shortly. But thank you so much. Really conscious of time. Thank you, Sheryl. Thank you, Joanne. It's been amazing to hear from you. Thank you, Simon, as well. A lot of great insights shared. This will be recorded and put online for people to access later on. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Brilliant. Thanks for hosting, Mac. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Mac.
Take care.